see over there. So, people are not sure. That's her. Why? All about. Oh, yeah. Yes. She's doing well. Nice. You would do all that.
The virtual audience is growing. We're at 73 participants. We're now at 80 participants.
You're gonna be right next to them.
If you are looking for the ATL zoning workshop, you are in the right place.
And for you.
We're allowing our in-person audience to come in and do so. And we'll get started in just a few moments.
Were you in the, I was, yeah, I was, okay. Yeah. You here? Yeah. Yeah. Everything all right? Yeah. I'm working. Yeah. Good. I feel like
Yeah.
Right, everybody. I know I've been up here a few times. I'm starting the meeting officially. Nice to see your beautiful, bright and shining faces here in the audience. My name is Vicky Fuller. I am your friendly community engagement manager. I like to make the joke that I am Spider-Man's cousin. Thank you for acknowledging that. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about ATL zoning 2.0, rewriting the city of Atlanta's zoning ordinance that's over 40 years old. Our virtual room is at 115 participants. Look behind me and tell me what the number is and growing. Thank you for coming in and joining us. You're in the right place. I want to acknowledge and give a special thank you to Jerome Russell and the Russell Innovation Center for Entrepreneurship for offering this beautiful space for those of you who are with us in person. You've noticed as you come up the third floor symposium conference room, and those of you who are online, it's an integrated facility with microphones throughout the room and a camera, so you all can be present with us here in the room. I will get started by introducing our presenter for tonight and principal planner of TSW Design, Kayla Resicott. Kayla, please get us started with the presentation tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Whitney, and good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Caleb Roscoe. I am project manager for the consulting team with TSW. And also joining me this evening are several other team members. But before we do that, I would like to acknowledge the council members that have joined us this evening. I see Councilwoman Bakhtiari in the back. I saw
But also great job on my pronunciation, my last name, thank you.
and Councilwoman Norwood. Thank you very much for joining us. And Councilman Westmore, thank you very much. Let me just do a little bit of making sure that this advances before I get started. Is it on? I am not the technical person. Give me a second. It is on, Whitney. And we just had Councilwoman Overton join us. Thank you
Oh.
very much. Great. Well, now, while we're waiting for the EV to get started, I also did want to introduce several of our team members who are here this evening. As you know, the zoning ordinance rewrite is being led by Atlanta-based TSW, and I'm here with the company as well as Houston Harris, who is behind the black door working on the IT. Additionally, we do have several other local team members who are here this evening with Canvas Planning. We have Eric Fortner in the back, who is helping us keep advised of sort of zoning and local planning considerations. We have Christy Dobson with Code Studio in the back, who is also helping us out. And then I don't believe we have any of our legal team members here tonight, but we do have a legal team led by some local attorneys. And then finally, certainly last but not least, Content Consulting, who is helping with the outreach. Thank you. All right. As was mentioned, this is one of 4 focused workshops to come up with a strategy for how do we update the city of Atlanta zoning. As Whitney Fuller mentioned, the zoning code has not been updated entirely for around 40 years. And so we're at a very important juncture, a very important opportunity to update the code and development regulations in such a way that they meet the needs of Atlanta today and the needs of Atlanta in the future. Now we're doing that through a series of 4 exploratory workshops where we work with the community and begin to understand alternatives for consideration before we even start writing anything. So we actually did have a first workshop last month, 2 months ago now, where we focused on what we're calling citywide alternatives. We have another citywide meeting this evening, which you're at, to talk also about those issues that apply citywide. And then we're going to follow them in late February and April with 2 more focused conversations, one of which is on the Atlanta city design and growth areas, which are more commercial and mixed-use portions of the city, and then what we call the conservation areas, which are more of the wooded neighborhoods. But before we do that, we wanted to allow everyone to participate in a survey to find out how exactly they learned about this meeting this evening. So if you can go to Mentimeter, there will certainly be a link up front that we're getting rid of. There should actually be a code showing as well. So go to
The code is, well, there's just a website. It's venti.com/AL90I2JJ878B9. That's for our in-person audience. If you are virtual, you can participate in the automated poll that should have just popped up on your screen. And the question is, how did you hear about this meeting? If you received an email, you can select e-blast, and it looks like 53% of our virtual audience received it that way.
Okay, a lot of folks in the email.
If you received a Facebook post or noticed a Facebook post and registered there, Or did you receive the notice by way of Instagram, LinkedIn?
This is the wrong link. It's wrong link.
The link is not working.
It led to a different question. So did we attend the last meeting?
Oh.
That's what that means.
Well, this is very minor. Let's, if we're going to get the survey to work, this is our only opportunity. Let's move on with the content. If you want to go to the next one with me? Houston, can we advance? And for those of you who now have the question about whether or not you did attend the last workshop, please let us know.
Thank you, virtual audience. We know we're challenged with a couple of technical issues with our audio. Thank you for bearing with us. And thank you for participating in the poll. 53% of the online participants received an email. The question that was advanced for our in-person audience, did you attend the last focus workshop meeting? Is that what y'all got?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try that one again. Did you participate in it?
We can also do a raise of hand if it's easier. Yeah. So if we're at the last workshop, say you're in person, let us know. Okay, so probably about a third of you. And I would assume the remaining 2/3 did not attend. Is that correct? Raise your hand. Okay, so maybe 50-50. So with that said, we're going to go into a little bit of detail on background and then focus on the conversation this evening. So Houston, can we go to the next slide? All righty, well, while they're doing that, I'm going to tell you what the content is. So, as we mentioned, we are here to talk about an update to the City of Atlanta zoning ordinance. When we talk about the kind of changes that regulate zoning in the City of Atlanta, it really falls into two types of standards. The first is what we call the zoning ordinance, which is the actual text of the Code of Ordinances that defines what the standards are in various parts of the state. This is the written word and is where we expect to make many, many changes as part of this particular document. As was mentioned, the code is over 40 years old, has a lot of inconsistent language, and has a lot of opportunities to improve it. So we envision that there will be many, many updates to the actual code of the zoning ordinance. However, the zoning ordinance text is not the only tool that regulates zoning in the City of Atlanta. The next part of it is what we call the official zoning map. This is a map that shows what different properties across the city are zoned. You may be an R5 district, which has a set of regulations associated with it. You may have a C1, which is a commercial district, which has a different set of regulations. As part of this zoning ordinance rewrite, we do not envision any substantial changes to the zoning map. So this is primarily about changing the regulations, creating new tools that can apply in different parts of the city, and then allowing the actual zoning map changes to be informed by future planning processes, especially the comprehensive development plan. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Zoning and the CDP, zoning and the comprehensive development plan, are inherently linked in the City of Atlanta. These are both major tools the City of Atlanta uses to guide and shape urban development. And they're inherently connected at the hip. You really can't change one without changing the framework for the other. And so as part of that, the City of Atlanta has decided that both the update of the zoning code, meaning the structure of the zoning code, the way the zoning ordinance is laid out, and the structure of the CDP really need to be looked at the same time. Because again, today there is such a strong one-to-one relationship that if we thought about just changing the zoning ordinance and not changing the CDP, we constantly have a tension between the two. So the city has decided that as part of this process to update the zoning code, there's also going to be a parallel effort to make sure that the new comprehensive development plan, which is the policy framework, aligns with that. And so generally speaking, we are going to be working on the zoning code rewrite for about 2 more years. Really developing language, developing specific regulations. In tandem with that, there will be a process to update the comprehensive where neighborhoods and other parts of the city can determine what kind of places they want to be, what kind of development can they have, what kind of these new regulations might be appropriate to apply to them. And then eventually, when the new code is adopted, then begin a process to actually apply those to different neighborhoods. And given that, I also wanted to remind everyone that we are taking a very deliberate effort to go from very general in concept down to very specific. And I've said before that I know that a lot of that is going to frustrate people because some people already know exactly what piece of the zoning code they want changed. They already know exactly what they want a certain property in the zone. But we really need to sort of agree on the kind of rules first, finalize the rules, and then get to an approach where they apply to different areas. So that's going to take a relatively long process. Now, as I mentioned, this is the second workshop, the second citywide workshop on alternatives. And I did want to run very briefly through some of the feedback that we did have from the last workshop. The good news is that the last workshop was pretty well attended. We had over 2,000 unique participants. That's online, that's people who mailed us things, that's people who sent us individual emails, that's people who submitted through the website. So Atlanta is a city of 500,000, so it's not a huge percentage, but in the scope of city planning, it actually is a pretty good number when you think about it. The other thing that's great is we did have over 5,000 visits to the online survey. A lot of folks reviewed it, a lot of folks took it. And so I was really very pleased with that. What more exciting was actually the level of the content and the comments that we received. We received over 2,261 written survey comments. And so myself and Houston and my staff, we had the great pleasure of reading through all of those and making sure that we sort of have a running list of themes and ideas and concepts that are coming in. Additionally, we did receive a couple that were mailed or emailed for people who weren't able to attend the workshops or just felt better doing it on paper or in writing. And then very exciting, we received 271 map-specific comments. These are things like, these are sites that we could potentially look at as ways to test alternatives in the new zoning ordinance, but there are also a lot of very specific zoning ideas about specific areas of the city that were quite informative to the process. And then, of course, the nature of the comments was all over the place, but we did have several very recurrent themes that I wanted to talk to you about. Probably the biggest was housing. There were a lot of folks who were very concerned about the housing crisis in the city of Atlanta, and a lot of very specific comments about how the zoning ordinance can encourage the creation of housing in areas that are appropriate for it. Additionally, a lot of comments about parking, and we're here to talk about parking this evening. And then a variety of other sort of related comments about neighborhood preservation, about Meta Beltline, and general nature of development. So that was really positive. But we did receive several, I guess, negative comments that we wanted to see. The first was that the survey, the workshop was very tough. And part of that is because, unfortunately, the zoning code today is technical, and all zoning ordinances are going to be technical. But we've made a deliberate effort this evening to try to simplify what we talked about and provide multiple levels of engagement. The other thing that we noticed, and again, I mentioned some folks were going to be really frustrated by sort of the lack of specificity, is we were only asking people about whether concepts should go in the zoning. but they weren't actually vetted out. We didn't want to put anything on paper until we knew if there was general support. So a lot of you were very frustrated because we didn't give a lot of detail. And again, that was intentional, but nevertheless frustrated with you. And then the other thing that we noticed was that, as mentioned before, a lot of people who were very familiar with the zoning ordinance felt like we didn't go into detail enough. And those who knew nothing about zoning just felt that it was way too much detail. And so we've come up with an approach that we hope will allow people with different levels of zoning knowledge have meaningful engagement into this process. There were also a series of dozens of questions that we asked, and I did want to hit on some of the big ones because I think the results were interesting. The first one was that there was a general support for this idea of a zone string, which if you didn't attend the last meeting, is basically a way to create a zoning ordinance that can be more customized in different parts of the city. So that, for example, the regulations that apply in Edgewood are not the same as the regulations that apply in Summerhill, are not the same as the regulations that apply in Vine City. So a lot of support for that, but at the same time, a lot of people wanted much more detail. That's again partially intentionally, but is nevertheless a critique. Additionally, there were certain questions that people really didn't care too much about, but those who did care had very strong opinions. One of those areas was parking decks. And that kind of makes sense. If you think about where the parking decks are going, they're going up in Midtown, they're going up in parts of along the Beltline, parts of Buckhead. But if you didn't live in one of those neighborhoods, you probably didn't have very strong opinions about it. But again, if you did, you generally speaking seem to want to have some more design regulations for that, some perhaps better screening. And then of course, there was also a lot of tentative support for some of the other big picture ideas. One of those was updating the way we handle density and building height to really encourage quality development. A lot of folks wanted much more detail, and they were very interested in, if we do that, are there other things that have to be done in correlation with that? So again, I think from my perspective, we have permission to begin to look at changing those things in the right zoning ordinance, but we need to do a lot better job to give a lot more detail when we come to specific proposals. And then finally, this is really a follow-up to my earlier conversation. As we all know, the City of Atlanta constituency has very strong opinions about the conservation areas. A lot of comments about trees and environmental protection, even though we're not necessarily changing the tree ordinance. A lot of very direct comments about preserving single-family housing. And again, we all know the history of why that has transpired. And then at the same time, a lot of comments about creating new zoning districts that can have a single-family character, but might not be single-family use in areas that are appropriate for that. And so, from my perspective, all of these things are within the toolbox of what the zoning code can inform. But the placement of those is going to be, assuming we talk about doing that changes, is going to be more around land use policy in the CUP. And so that's why, in many ways, we knew that was, and we actually have dedicated a meeting to that very topic, of how do we grow, how do we preserve, what kind of regulations in much more detail are appropriate in conservation areas. So with that said, that was an overview of the meeting in November. But what I wanted to do now is talk to you about what we're really here to focus on this evening, which is another set of citywide regulations, primarily focused, as I mentioned, on parking, on what we call use standards, and on what we call site standards. So these are different kind of regulations that the city uses. Now, as a reminder, tonight you're going to see a variety of alternatives for consideration that have been developed based on the diagnostic report that we all worked on several years ago now, but also directly through some of the feedback that we have received today. And we're going to frame each of these in the context of these are problems or deficiencies with the current code, and these are potential alternative solutions. And so as a reminder, when you do participate in the workshop, we ask you all to step beyond your own personal thoughts and really focus on what you believe is best for the city of Atlanta in terms of both current needs of cities, parts of the city and neighborhoods today, but also future needs in that consider various city plans, you know, the comprehensive development plan, the Beltline plans, the various neighborhood plans that we have. We also ask you to think about issues of trade-offs, because as someone who writes zoning sort of across the region, one of the things that I'm very aware of is that people like to put everything into zoning. And sometimes there can be a lot of conflicts. And so we ask you this evening, or we ask you in the coming weeks, as you think about these alternatives, really consider what other areas they may in this idea of trade-off. And that's why we do have a couple of potentially conflicting alternatives in the survey. It was directly asked. And then finally, I did want to remind everyone that we have not done anything yet. There is no draft zoning ordinance sitting at my computer at the office. It doesn't exist. We're still learning the process. Now, with that said, I did want to mention a major change from last time, which I hope will help a lot of you who are have different levels of understanding of zoning. Based on the feedback before, we have set up the coming workshops, including tonight, to have really two levels of input. The first series is what we're calling the primary questions. These are very easy to understand, open questions that in some ways are more about the kind of city we want to be than what the zoning code actually says. And so when you participate in the exercises, there's going to be a series of open-ended questions. You know, what do you think about parking requirements? What do you think about X, Y, Z? Those are for the folks who don't have a lot of technical knowledge of the zoning code. And we ask everyone to try to participate in that. But as we go forward, a lot of the devil is going to be in detail. So we do have a second series of questions that are going to be in the online survey that we're calling clarifying questions, where we do go into a lot more detail about specific zoning concepts. So if you're a person who's never been to a zoning meeting before, the primary questions are probably where you're going to feel most comfortable. But you by all means can participate in the secondary, in the clarifying questions. But if you're someone who's gone to every NPU meeting for 30 years, you've read the zoning code for that, or you just know a little bit about zoning, you'll probably feel very comfortable in the clarifying questions. So with that said, as I mentioned tonight, we are going to talk about parking, we're going to talk about use standards, and we're going to talk about set standards. And I wanted to mention too, because I don't think this was very clear at the last workshop, that all of these kind of regulations already exist in every zoning district in the city of Atlanta. Every zoning district has parking requirements or not. Every zoning district has a set of permitted uses. There are also some use standards or use requirements that apply everywhere in the city. And then various zoning districts have various what we call site standards. And so those are already things in the zoning code that can be incorporated into new zoning code with this idea of a zone strip that we talked about. It's not creating new regulations. It's changing how the existing regulations can be applied in different areas. And so I wanted to put that out because I think it's true. So the first one is parking. Vehicle parking requirements specifically, and then we'll talk about bike parking requirements. So today, vehicular parking requirements are generally tied to the zoning district, not the location and context, which means that if I'm a business owner, I have a C1 property, my parking requirement is going to be the same if I'm in a neighborhood where everyone arrives by car versus where everyone arrives on foot or bicycles. That is somewhat an outdated way to look at zoning. And so one of the things that we do is think about creating standards that focus on location or context, meaning time to parking, time to place your room, access to transit, the access to trails, rather than just the arbitrary zoning. Additionally, a lot of the parking requirements are relatively high in some parts of the city. And this is even compared to the suburbs, and when I look at Alpharetta, Roswell, Snellville, and Atlanta does have a couple of uses with pretty high parking requirements. And so there might be an opportunity to refresh some of those. And then, of course, another problem with the parking requirements, as we all know, is they do impact tree lots, stormwater, urban heating, design, walking, bicycling, and transit. You know, parking affects so many different things in the city, which is why it's really important to look at this to the parking. I think my clicker is dead. We have to keep the door open. Here we go. Sorry. Sure. So the other issue with the vehicular parking requirements, I think it's very important to acknowledge, is that they are really expensive, both in terms of the cost of construction and the land that they eat up in areas where it may not be needed. And that's especially for the 16.4% of households in the city that land who don't own a car. That we need to acknowledge that fact that even though I'm sure the majority of folks in this room drive, there are a lot of folks in the city who do not own. And then finally, two other issues related to parking that I did want to talk about because there were several comments in the first workshop about them, is that parking today, for better or worse, is the primary tool, the primary zoning tool that the city of Atlanta uses to regulate what we're calling alcohol-related land use. And what that means is that there's several decades of history of using parking requirements to keep places like North Island Avenue, Virginia Harmony, Basement and Village, or Little Five Points, or even Westview Commercial District, from becoming all bars and restaurants. There have been ways that parking is used to effectively control the proliferation of uses. And so if we are to think about updating parking requirements, we also do need to acknowledge that in some cases, there are going to be large regional uses with alcohol licenses that are going to drive people from 50, 60, 70 miles away, and people are going to buy it. And that's part of why parking and alcohol uses are located under S terms. Okay, there will be other tools. We can look at those if there's support for uncoupling those, but that's what the references to. And finally, there's a couple of weird provisions in the zoning code that actually discourage shared parking in some areas, not everywhere in some. The second area is bicycle parking is the same across the city, and that's something that we actually updated a couple of years ago. I think based on a recent survey of national bike parking standards, Atlanta's are pretty good. May not be as good as they used to be, and areas like the East Side Belt Line, where we have a higher bike ridership, but they are on a citywide basis generally good. But as I mentioned, there's no consideration of cyber context. Now, there's an unusual provision that has come up a lot in recent years, and it is that the bike parking requirements never exceed 50 required spaces per building. So what that means is that if I'm doing a 300 to 400 apartment or 300 to 400 unit apartment building, we never have to provide more than 50 parking spaces. And so there has been a lot of comment that we've received that we might think about taking away that cap. You know, we have no cap. We have no cap for any other parking requirements of this nature, and so it might make sense to think about getting that. And then,
Sorry, clarifying question. Do you mean allowing there to be higher parking, or do you mean is that what you're?
Yeah. The specific question, the specific idea is getting rid of that upper limit. So saying that, right now we say you never have to provide more than 50. regardless of how big your development is. This would say it is proportional to the size of the. If that makes any sense.
But fine.
And then there are also some updated standards that relate to the amount of parking that could be required. In terms of vehicular parking, we could develop different standards for housing, businesses, we could develop context-sensitive standards, we could develop parking maximums or update parking maximums. These are all given in much further detail on the board, what exactly they entail. We could also look at removing barriers to shared parking, both formal and informal standards. We could also look at updating the standards so that alcohol-related uses are not only regulated in parking today. Again, this is one of those things that is really technical, but it does have a very strong on-the-ground impact, especially when you're talking about very regional alcohol-related draws. We could think about limiting surface parking, perhaps in some parts of the city, or not. And then, of course, we could think about various standards to update bike lanes, like lifting the 50-face cap, context-aware standards, so you might have a higher bike parking requirement if you're on a trail or in the walkable urban neighborhood than if you are outside 285, where very few people bicycle. That's the kind of concept that we could look at. So the second set of regulations or concepts tonight is related to the issue of uses. And really what a use means is, what is the property's function? What is it used for? Is it housing? Is it, or is it a single family house? Is it a duplex? Is it a restaurant? Is it retail? And all of those things are regulated in the zoning code, but there are a lot of problems from our perspective or opportunities to improve them. The first is that they're very undefined or inconsistent. Most cities have a standard set of use definitions that they use in every area. Atlanta isn't that way. Some zoning districts use one term, some zoning districts use another, and so there's definitely an opportunity to address that. Additionally, Atlanta does have some very outdated terms that just don't reflect the kinds of ways people use property today, especially things like the newer uses like e-commerce. And you may, for those of you who participate in your FPU or in zoning, you may know that ghost kitchens were recently updated, and this is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about, new uses that really don't fit well into the zoning code today. We also have one highly restricted citywide standard of home occupation and home business, and some very, very, very broad use categories, especially related to what I just talked about before, under the issue of what I would call alcohol-related uses. Things like restaurants versus bars versus lounge versus nightclubs. They're all defined in the alcohol control ordinance separately, but they're not defined separately in the zoning code. And so we might be able to where the hates. Need to advance with you.
While we're off, Caleb, I'd actually like to acknowledge that the virtual audience has experienced some audio challenges hearing us. It's a little bit of an echo. While it's convenient in the room for us to have this microphone, so it's and speakers, so you can hear us clearly and loudly, there's a bit of an echo for the online audience, and we have been monitoring and making adjustments as best we can. We'll try to troubleshoot once we get to Q&A. And again, once we do our breakout for social pinpoint. Thank you for all of your patience. And for closed captioning, which will probably improve your listening experience, you can go to the bottom of your Zoom screen where there are multiple icons. Look next Look next to your chat icon, your Q&A icon, and there is a CC icon for closed captioning that you can select as the participant to enable the captions to be read, and hopefully that improves your experience. The first zoning workshop that we held at Habitat for Humanity headquarters on Metropolitan Avenue was recorded, and you can find that on YouTube by searching ATL planning. You can also find a recording of that meeting, and this one, as a matter of fact, thank you all for your beautiful patience, by the way, at atlzoning.com. Select meet and participate, navigate the menu to previous meetings, and that's where you'll find the recording. Thank you so much, Caleb.
Thank you. The other problem with the use standards is that they have inconsistent or insufficient use standards. What a use standard is basically a set of specific requirements that are predefined in a zoning ordinance to mitigate the negative impact that certain types of uses have. And in the case of Atlanta, there are areas where we think there might be consideration of additional regulations. For example, self-storage, which we know is always a big issue, the issue of drive-through and drive-ins, the issues of data centers, gas stations, etc. And these type of uses tend to be pretty well regulated in the areas of the city with newer zoning districts, but they're not as well regulated in areas that don't have that. And if you look at the news every couple of weeks, that always does tend to create problems, especially in the communities that don't have those particular protections. And so moving forward, we have an opportunity to update the zoning ordinance. We plan on creating a completely reformatted use section of the code that defines every particular use, but there's also an opportunity to actually begin to come up with new use standards. And so one of the questions this evening is going to ask you to look at a variety of what we would call problematic uses, at least from what we've heard, and ask you if you think those might consider a little bit more regulation in some or all of the city. Additionally, another opportunity to consider is related to what we're calling non-conforming legacy buildings. These are the buildings that are all over the city of Atlanta that were probably built before zoning existed. And because of that, they're oftentimes, there are challenges to reusing them. And so one of the questions that we're going to ask you to consider is whether or not any of these kind of legacy buildings and uses really deserve special consideration of the zoning ordinance, such that if the building, for example, was built as a shop front in 1915, should it always be able to be a shop front, or should it have to convert to housing if the zoning changes? So we ask you to think about whether there are any of these legacy uses in the city that might warrant special protection. And I remind you that a couple of years ago, the city of Atlanta actually determined that apartment buildings built before 1945 with between 4 and 12 units warranted this kind of protection. And so what they did is they changed the zoning code such that if that building burns down or is significantly renovated, it never loses what is called its grandfather status. And so that's what this question is really about. Are there kind of uses that should be allowed to continue if they were a historic use? Another area to improve the zoning ordinance relates to the changing nature of what we would call very, very, very light industrial uses or makerspace. There may be opportunity to look at allowing what we call makerspace in some of our mixed use districts. Basically, what this means is a facility where people may have some very light productions, things like a furniture maker or a dressmaker or a 3D printer, or anything that involves production of a good, which today is typically relegated to industrial districts. But as you know, the world is changing. A lot more of that is happening in an office setting or in a sort of co-worker space setting. So we could think about adding that. Additionally, there are a series of alternatives for updating home occupation standards. there are questions related to updating its requirements, whether or not we should require mixed use in certain districts. And then a whole series of questions about should the zoning ordinance have specific tailored incentives or standards for small businesses. And I don't just mean small in terms of the revenue, but I mean physically small businesses in neighborhoods. And then the final set of questions tonight relates to environmental standards. These are really everything that happens on a property that is not related to the use of the property. And so there are very inconsistent site standards in a couple of places across the zoning code. Dumpster screening, loading dock screening, mechanical equipment screening, and outdoor storage screening. And what we mean by this is that if you happen to be in one of the newer zoning districts, like any of you see in the mixed use areas today, those districts already have requirements that dumpsters are screened, loading docks are screened, all of these things are taken care of. But if there happens to be a newer zoning district that applies, no such protections apply consistently. Now, the health code does have some standards, there are other standards, but there's no consistent universal standard related to these. And so additionally, there's a question in here or an observation that relates to building access. And what this is about is that we all know that the city is moving to much greater walkability, but we do continue to have areas where the building may have been built 40 years ago and is 80 feet, 100 feet back from the street. We could update the zoning code to require accessible walkways to the sidewalk for that condition. Again, if it's an existing building, or if it happens to be in an area where that's what the neighborhood plans call for. You know, in one of those parts of the city outside of I-285, where it is relatively suburban in nature. There's no requirement for walkways today. That's something that is pretty common in the metro area. And then a final one that sort of picks up on a conversation last time relates to retaining walls, particularly retaining walls along the sidewalk. Again, any of the newer zoning districts in the city would not allow what you see here before you on Fulton and Somerville. This is a 20, 22 foot high retaining wall right at the back of the sidewalk, right across from the historic church, right across from historic multi-family houses. It would be very easy to update the zoning code to address this kind of thing consistently. The reason this particular property was allowed to do it is because it's one of the older zoning districts. It's an RG zoning district. And this, again, my opinion, I think the opinion of city policy, this kind of thing is really inconsistent with the patterns of neighborhoods that we talked about before, and really detrimental to the desire for walkability and a lot of the other things that I'm going to miss out. So with that said, the questions here will relate to whether or not we have requirements for screening, whether or not we adopt requirements for walkways, and then whether or not we adopt requirements for retaining wall height limits, potentially on a citywide basis. And so all of those are going to be provided both around the room for those of you who are here in person, or in the online survey. There's a link to a series of boards that give you a little bit more detail, a little bit more specificity.
We're going to test the microphones for the benefit of the virtual audience. Without this microphone, they are experiencing an echo. Can you all hear me in the back? And we'll do our best to vocalize this way. So Caleb, we're going to go into Q&A. I'll co-host with you for the Q&A of our virtual audience. The first question from our virtual audience was, is this subject matter different for every meeting?
Yes. Sorry, no microphone. Yes, we have set this up such that these are intended to be citywide meetings, and the content is different for each one. So again, the first one was a citywide set of regulations. This one is also a citywide set of regulations. And then we're going to have a set of citywide conversations on growth areas and conservation areas with different content for everyone.
Thank you, Caleb. The virtual audience says that their audio has improved. We were on a ride over here, you all. respond to make sure that they're included. So before we go into the rest of Q&A, I would just like to acknowledge you again. Thank you for your patience, and this meeting is being recorded. You can visit atlzoning.com and navigate to the menu for participation to meet and participate, where you can find a meeting link for this meeting. You'll also find a recording that will be uploaded after this meeting to that website, so you can listen to the portion that you weren't able to hear before. In-person audience, your questions are bubbling in your head. Please line up in the center of the room if you would like to ask your questions now, and we'll address them now. We'll also have a breakout session that you can ask one-on-one questions and have your conversation there. So if there's no hurry to line up, I'll go to the virtual audience and we'll kind of rotate back and forth. If you will, keep your question to one question, about 2 minutes, and Caleb will keep his response similarly brief.
Are the questions only about the subject matter today?
Yes, sir. Question about tonight's subject matter.
And if you'll just introduce yourself, Kieta.
Good evening, everyone. Kieta Holmes, Director of the Office of Zoning and Development, in the Department of City Planning.
Yes, Florence Cross. I have a question. This is great doing the stakeholder meeting, get input from everybody. But from what I've been told from y'all and others, most of the audience is homeowners. You don't have many of the millennials, renters. How do you go about getting a better survey of the whole population? That's my question. What can be done to hear from them?
Sure. So I have directed the team to engage with social media influencers, engage with the Renters Association, as well as the Home Builders Association, as well as directed targets toward educational institutions, as well as religious institutions and other institutions where different kinds of people meet and congregate. The community engagement team has been doing that since we started engaging on this topic last November. And many of those people are many of the numbers of people that you see in our virtual audience, as well as in this room, is because of that outreach.
There's a question from the virtual audience, Caleb. Have Atlanta's needs been based and reviewed with updated data from the 2020 census and the changes in resident and work patterns due to the pandemic?
So the question was, have the needs changed based on the census and the pandemic? Absolutely. A couple of the questions tonight related to home occupation, related to makerspace. Those are trends that we've seen in the past 2 to 3 years really come to the fore. Additionally, there is new housing data out. In fact, the American Community Survey, which is the census data, came out relatively recently. And no surprise, Atlanta is continuing to lose its lower income residents. That is data that we're absolutely aware of, which is part of, I think, framing the conversation.
Right. You talked a lot about rewriting the actual zoning districts. Are you considering, or are you planning to rewrite the process by which rezoning, variances, special use permits, special administrative permits are carried out? And I'm asking because, like, I'm a homeowner, I serve on our neighborhood land use committee, and I'm also a professional architect. I do this rezoning professionally. And on both ends, there's a lot of frustration and confusion and time, and if people don't understand how these processes are carried out, how they get involved. It's so complex.
The procedures related to changes or relief from the code via variance or a special exception, or to change the regulations on a property via a rezoning or a special use permit, are protected by the zoning procedures law. The city of Atlanta follows that law exactly. We receive an application, it goes to the MPU, it gets public comment, it goes to a board, and then it goes to city council. I think the confusion lies in people not understanding that it's a very linear process. However, when it gets to the community engagement process and it's in the neighborhoods, that's where it takes the longest time, because people are concerned about their community and how those things that are being done in their community are processed. So we're not considering any changes to the process because it is protected by the zoning procedures law. We will have an effort to make it clearer for people, and help them understand that the community engagement process is the process where the meat of the matter happens and where all the devil in the details happen.
Caleb and Kieta, I have several questions online about affordability, specifically housing affordability, and several questions about parking. There's also a thank you for the audio issue improving. I'll just ask that the speakers asking questions when you come up to announce your name and attempt to speak as loudly as possible. There's a question online, Caleb and Kieta, about the CDP zoning rewrite and how they work together, and how does the CDP and NPU go? Well, the CDP and NPU supposedly go hand in hand. So will that include changes to the NPU system in either of these processes?
No, ma'am.
Thanks. If you'll introduce yourself and ask your question, thank you.
Hi, I'm Will Stocks, and I live in Midtown in PUE. So something that stuck out to me listening to this presentation was there's a lot of talk about very, very specific use categories. Maybe there are uses that we don't have considered in the current plan. And then there's also been some mentions of ways that we've kind of had to work backwards, and some things that got built before zoning was even around, corner stores, smaller apartment buildings, having to add new carve outs and additional complexity to be able to preserve those. Is there any thought being given to not making those same mistakes again and being overly prescriptive this time, so that we don't end up 20 years from now having to add more special districts and carve outs to fix stuff that we accidentally outlawed? And I guess more specifically, do we have any sort of zoning tool being considered to be introduced in this code? And I apologize if something similar exists right now and I'm not familiar. That's a little more of a hands-off wild card designation of, you know, outside of these specific nuisance uses, you know, whatever those might be, build what you think needs to be built there. And if that's a corner store, if that's housing for a office nearby, are we thinking of maybe going even a step beyond just the string flexibility and actually kind of going a little more hands-off in some areas to allow that to happen a little more organically?
Yeah, in terms of uses, I would say Atlanta's zoning is so old that it's actually really current with regard to use. Like Atlanta has one definition for retail. A lot of the suburbs define every 50 type of retail establishment. So in some ways, Atlanta's ordinance is very broad. So I think as we begin to clean up the use categories, we're going to really focus on making sure that the categories of use are proportional to their impact, rather than, you know, whether or not it's a dressmaker versus a hat shop, you know, that kind of.
Right.
So I think cleaning up the use groups is very particular. Your question about where uses are allowed, there is one of our questions last week or last month, time flies, was actually about creating new districts that might be able to have that character if they wanted. So absolutely, when we talk about this idea of zone strings, which is the idea that you can decouple the use of a property from the form, you know, once that framework is set up, you can have an area that wants a certain lot size and they want it to look like a house. And they may want the use to have that only a single family in some areas, but they may want to dial it all the way up without changing the other two in some other neighborhoods, so that it's much more broad. It's similar to the kind of uses you could do in a midtown state. But I think that the idea is going to be the coupling of those strings, the combination of those strings will have the ability to do that. But a lot of that is going to come out of the conflict.
I guess I'm just asking, with the zoning strings, is there any thought that maybe there would be an area that has zoning strings that have an asterisk somewhere in that string that means
No, sir.
for this?
No, sir.
Okay.
Thank you for your comment.
Whitney, yes, thank you. Online participants, if you raise your hand, we don't have the ability to acknowledge you audibly tonight. Please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. I've seen a few questions in the chat box, and I'll read the next question from the Q&A box. How will the zoning rewrite affect the SPI, Special Public Interest Zoning District?
Well, the zoning rewrite tonight, or what you all have said, is you want to consider zone strength. Zone strength would be the zoning district designation. And so whatever it's a one-to-one conversion. So an SPI becomes a zone strength.
Hey, good evening. My name is Kwame Ofori. I am a Summer Hill resident, City Council District 1, HOA member, and advocate for electric vehicle charging as well as climate protection and clean energy. I'm wondering with zoning, this new zoning renewal that we're going to, are there any provisions to strengthen new properties or new zoning in order to incorporate more EV charging for multifamily, for businesses? I know we already have the EV ready ordinance that's already in effect since 2017. Keisha Lance Bottom administration did that. However, that just requires places to be EV ready. Now, for multifamily, it's going to be very important. For businesses, it's going to be very important in order to encourage EV growth, to have stronger requirements behind that. Has there been any conversation behind that, and what can we do to push that forward?
I would say a lot of the zoning districts, the newer ones, already do have an EV requirement in them. This is different from the EV ready. So obviously, when we incorporate that into the new framework, we'll have to have some standards. But by all means, put that in your comments.
I just have a quick question about the zoning.
Just a point of clarification, Caleb, when you said housing is the #1 concern for people involved in the rewrite effort so far, is that right? Are there trends you found in their input?
There were a lot of comments about how, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. There were a lot of comments about housing. You know, many of those were identical. They were, as you know, they were sort of promoted by some organizations. But when you get beyond the ones that were copy pasted, there was just a lot of interest in housing and affordability and the nature of housing in the city of Atlanta. That was all I meant by that comment.
I just was wondering, in the graph, I noticed that there wasn't the I fully support. There, you know, of all the things that you could select. And I didn't see, does that mean that there was nobody said any of the survey results?
It may have been an export error. I mean, that was just a summary that I did.
I just didn't see anything that said I fully support. So I just was wondering, tentative support for zoning strings, but I didn't see any I fully support. I actually don't think I saw any I fully support on other graphs that I looked at.
It may have been an exporting issue. I'll have to go into Social Pinpoint and look.
Will we be able to see the survey results from the first workshop?
Yeah, we're still processing them. Again, there were 2,600 comments. And
yeah,
a lot of them had proper nouns in them, like so-and-so. So we're adding them, but we can put out the survey results.
Yeah.
But the specific comments we need to go through.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, comments fine.
By all means, that's on our to-do list.
Thanks.
The city of Atlanta released a very comprehensive vision for the city in 2017 by publishing its book, Atlanta City Design, Aspiring to the Beloved Community. How much of that vision is guiding the planning for the zoning rewrite?
The Atlanta City Design is the vision document for the city. It was adopted to the city charter in 2017. All the work the Department of City Planning has done, the comprehensive development plan, this zoning rewrite, is all to align with the 5 core values of Atlanta City Design, which is why you see all of the information here related to conservation district, growth district, and all the other ideas that were iterated in Atlanta City Design.
Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm David Benson, Loring Heights, which is in UE. I had a question just about precedent, and certainly TSW's done this for other cities and certainly studied good examples of these rewrite processes, especially when it comes to parking minimums, maximums, you know, what the sweet spot is there. I feel like there's, you know, good and bad examples. I'm thinking of San Francisco that's gone the way of, you know, everything's hyper expensive there. You've got maybe the bad example of Houston where everything's kind of sprawling. But I know places do this well. So I was wondering if you have kind of those places, cities here or abroad that you're really drawing on as those are kind of gold standards of these processes that have good codes related to that.
We are really trying to write this based on Atlanta, but I think in the way things are presented, absolutely, there are codes that do it much better. In terms of parking, one that I really like is the recent ones that Boston adopted, where their parking requirements are completely separate. They're actually it's just a map of the city. If you're in this part of the city and there's no transit, you have a different parking ratio than you do in downtown Crossing or in different parts of the city. So it's very context-based. But in terms of the actual numbers, those are all going to be formed by the Atlanta patterns.
Thank you.
We have several questions in queue online, and we have 5 people in queue in person. I'll make a recommendation that we allow the folks that are in queue in line to go ahead and ask your questions, and our virtual audience will address you in FAQ and email after this meeting. Does that sound okay? Okay, perfect.
Hi, my name is Griffin Watson. I live in MPUW in Ormwood Park. I'm a civil engineer by training. Last time I asked about how you're going to let maybe some of the mathematical implications of urban design guide this process here. And I know that you said earlier that we didn't want to get too technical, but I'm worried that from the previous survey, there wasn't enough information about how some of the technical decisions will have outcomes that affect people in real life. So some of us who sat around and actually read through some of the zoning code, you might see for a commercial district, it says that for every 600 square feet of retail, that you need 2 parking spaces. Well, 2 parking spaces is 600 square feet of parking. So that means your parking lot has to be as big as a retail location. And I don't think we can skip the technical details. We also know that parking is a public finance black hole. I mean, you look at the Walmart on Martin Luther King Drive and the JR Cricket across the street from it. The JR Cricket that has no off-street parking pays property taxes at a rate 4 times higher than Walmart because we tax parking at a lower rate. So as we force businesses to add unnecessary parking, it's expensive to build the parking, expensive to maintain the parking, and it also means that long-term, we're going to have a public finance black hole because we can't actually afford to provide the services like sewer, water, and the other things to these buildings because there's just chasms of parking that you need to bridge across with infrastructure.
And your question is? Everything you said, yeah. You're talking to the choir, so.
It's can the survey communicate some of these outcome-based issues that are inherently technical?
We're not doing a fiscal analysis of the zoning code. That's ridiculous. And the places that do it, I would say are wrong because zoning is in place for 40 to 50 years. But as I said before, the qualitative discussions that you're talking about are really about the kind of neighborhoods that we want. And I think that's a compliment question.
I'm just worried people are going to express an opinion because they don't understand what the final
I-
outcome is.
Question connected to what you were asking.
Okay.
That was my question. So my name is Allison. I live in NQM. So very, very similar sort of, the question connected to that is, on this topic and moving forward, would you all be able to, really clearly articulate trade-offs and implications of, the decisions that you're asking us to make? I think on the survey, y'all did a pretty good job of that on as it related to parking decks, right? Because with some of the questions you were asking, should we mandate a particular type of parking deck? If so, it's more expensive to build, therefore it's going to cost more for the renter to sell the building or whatever it may be. But that didn't happen in every section. There were other sections that, for example, y'all asked about, should we incentivize like fountains without articulating. If that is the case, that means we might not incentivize affordable housing, or it might result in rent going up or cost of condos going up, something like that. So my question is, would you all be able to, moving forward, help us grapple with what those trade-offs are and the implications?
Obviously, these are very good questions. I think that we will certainly try to for the next round. I do want to say that the minute you have any specific trade-off, you're invariably going to leave some out. But we'll definitely try to do that.
Right.
We don't have any online, sorry.
No, we have many online. They are allowing-
My name is Anton Goodiswitz. I'm a resident of NPUE. So my question is concerning the historical corner stores and smaller spaces that aren't maybe compliant with the current ones. These are spaces that are, a lot of times they're beloved in the neighborhood, and if they've historically been able to have enable small businesses and provide more community atmosphere. And I'm wondering, in addition to allowing the current ones to maybe persist, is there any plan to enable something like an accessory commercial unit, or to allow more of these kinds of well-liked structures to be built?
Yeah, that was one of the ideas discussed at the last meeting, was about, do we want to create zoning districts that could have that under Atlanta patterns? There's not a specific comment today, with the exception of the accessory commercial. When you take, sorry, we're getting technical. One of the questions is about what we call home occupation, which is basically when you run a business out of your home. Today, and correct me if I'm wrong, you can run a business out of your home, but you can't sell anything out of your home. You can't have any customers buy. So one of the questions is, are there areas of the city where we tweak that? There may be neighborhoods that are comfortable with the things like you see in Grant Park, where there's a house and there's actually a little storefront attached. We don't know that at this point, but if that's the kind of thing that there's interest in putting in the zoning code for future applications in specific neighborhoods, now's the time. We need to know that that's important to some people, and we put it as an option to be applied down the road.
Hi, my name is Edith Latipo. I live in NPUR in Southwest Atlanta. I live about 10 steps from Cascade Road and about half a mile from Hamilton Road. I've been out in that community for about 47 years. And one of the things I'm really concerned about, I've spent a lot of time the last week looking around in other states to find out about this process. And I'm really a little concerned because it sounds to me, and I was back there, I wasn't going to say anything, but then I keep hearing us talk about making a community based on the people that are in it. And so then when something happens in the community for some reason and they want to go, the rest of the people are stuck with whatever somebody else or the majority of the people that were in that community at that time wanted. And I'm not hearing about, really land use planning and applying those principles of land use planning and having specific areas, specific things, environmental things. You have a spring that runs through the community. How do you protect that? What kind of zoning there is out there to protect that? I'm hearing this and I'm really concerned because the last time this thing made, I did not fit the change, but they changed me anyway. And, I was really upset about that. I was later told, well, you got the option, you sitting right there on the line, you got enough property. But the fact that somebody took my right away, keep my property what it was very concerning to me. So I'm really watching this process. I've seen some that are working in other communities, like in San Francisco and other places. And I would really like to have more land use design. How are we developing this city? What is it going to look like? What is the goal? What's the plan? How is it going to look like for my grandchildren? I want to see some serious plans going on and not just what somebody does.
So Plan A was the administrative update to the comprehensive development plan. The Office of Design team led by Mr. Doug Young is in the process right now of preparing for the next update in 2025. They've engaged with a team to write the comprehensive development plan. They're starting with some type of policy papers and gathering information in that land use policy planning that you're speaking of. That process is actually going on at the same time. So you'll hear more information coming out of the Office of Design. Mr. Young and Mr. Hosell, you can actually contact them. You can also speak with Mr. Aaron Fortner here tonight, who's the project manager, and you can hear all about what's coming with regard to the comprehensive development plan. The zoning ordinance itself, however, is the regulatory tool. It brings the vision to life. And that is what we're doing tonight. in the subsequent nights, is recreating the tool. Sir?
Hi, my name is Drew Alexander. I'm a renter resident of Midtown, NPUE. And so the question that I have is that I think it's a fairly objective statement to say that Atlanta is entering a housing crisis. Not a lot of affordable housing prices are rising fast, pricing renters out, etc. To me, that was obviously the root cause of X, Y, C decisions as it relates to zoning. But I find it very hard to figure out what those decisions are. Is it possible for the city to kind of do a retrospective to say that we arrived at this, destination that we're at now because of A, B, C decisions? And so therefore, when you're considering zoning reform, keep this in mind so you don't repeat the same things or you consider those trade-offs elsewhere. Because it's very hard for me when I look at this to kind of figure out, as somebody said, how do I make sure I'm not repeating what was done in the past that sort of led to the moment that it's now, right? If I got a better understanding of maybe what decisions were done previously, I could think of, oh, maybe we need to use an alternative now so that housing can become a little bit more affordable. That's just a recommendation that I would have.
There is I did not mention it this time, but there is a diagnostic report that is on the project website that actually does go into a lot of the history. And in the case of what you're mentioning, in some parts of the city, if you do an apartment, you have to provide 2 parking spaces that often exceed the price of building the apartment. So that kind of data is in the report. Please take a look at it. It's on the website, atlzoning.com, under Learn More, under Diagnostic Report. Yes, ma'am?
Hi, my name is Barbara Lyles Anderson. I'm a homeowner in MPUC. I'm also a registered professional civil environmental engineer. I have a general question here. I know you have specific agendas for the different zoning meetings. Is there going to be any meeting that addresses homeowner issues related to developers and erosion control and flooding that don't seem to be addressed at this point?
And I can answer too.
So we will not be talking about erosion control, because those are not under the purview of the zoning ordinance. We, however, are working with our watershed department partners as the regulations are written. They will be a part of those meetings, and so we'll be talking about how to mitigate any of those issues, flooding, et cetera, on homeowners, apartment dwellers, all kinds of things across the city. Because we are aware of a lot of flooding issues that occur citywide. We get the emails when those things occur.
I've been living a nightmare for years, so
And
I
I-
have a lot of input.
And to add on to that comment, when you do take the survey, you fill out the questions, anything that is a non-zoning idea, so it's a land use recommendation for a certain property, we're putting those into different buckets so that we can let the appropriate agencies know about it. If there's changes to the tree ordinance, there's sort of one bucket. If there's stuff MARTA should do, someone submitted this really complicated idea for a MARTA line in the online survey that would go through Atlantic Station. We got a bucket that we're going to share with MARTA. So one of them is environmental protection ordinances, and then one of them is also tree.
Caleb and Kieta, I'd just like to acknowledge the in-person audience. We've had over 50 questions come in our Q&A box, and we were only able to answer about 9. There are 29 still unanswered questions. I do want to acknowledge that we only have a certain amount of time together, and there are over 200 participants on virtual audience, as well as over 50 participants in this room. So we have prioritized some of the questions of our in-person audience, and we'll use our FAQ and email to communicate our responses to you all in virtual audience. Thank you for your understanding in advance.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for attending. Now's for the beginning of the fun part, which is going to last for about at least 10 days. We now have a little bit of time tonight for you to begin to tell us what's on your mind related to all of the things that we talked about. There is a series of boards around the room, and for those who are attending virtually, Alana will be walking you through how to take the survey online. Those are, again, the topics that we just discussed. If you are unable to fill out everything tonight, which is very likely, remember that you do have through the 27th to fill them out. The exercises, the questions are absolutely identical. So if you are interested in watching the video, it will be posted on the project website, atlzoning.com. And please make sure that you sign up for the next workshop, which is where we're going to get into even a bit more detail on growth areas for late February at Buckhead Library. So for those of you who are in the room, feel free to break either in this room or in the lobby out front and participate in the surveys. We're going to have these QR codes all over. So all you need to do is use your smartphone, point at it, and it will take you to the applicable exercise. If anyone does want to participate, but they don't have a mobile device, you can see me, you can see Houston, and we've got some Kindles and iPads that you can temporarily use for the evening as well. So again, thank you very, very much. Again, for those of you online, thank you very much as well. And again, we encourage you to take the survey and share it with your friends, especially friends who you feel may not be represented this evening. We really, truly do want to hear from everyone. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alana, and I will be giving you guys a walkthrough of how to take the survey. I just sent the link for you all to access the survey, or you can use the QR code that is on the screen. But I am actually going to go ahead and share my screen just so you can get a glimpse of what the survey will look like. Okay, as you can see that this is what the link that I just submitted into the chat will take you to. So this is just a little overview of what this workshop covered. And then if you press this right here, this will actually take you to what the in-person meeting boards look like. And then if you scroll down, there are 3. So we've set this.
Sorry, Alana, we can't see your screen share.
Oh, sorry about that. Let me try that again. Okay, can you see it now? Okay, so I am getting mixed answers here. But I will just go ahead and actually just explain this because there isn't very much for me to be sharing on my screen. So once you access the link that I shared in the group, this will take you to the survey homepage. And the content of this workshop is divided into 3 parts: theme I, theme J, and theme K. And each theme is divided into 2 levels: primary questions and clarifying questions. So if you start with theme I, parking requirements, you press take the survey and it will open a pop-up. And this is overview of the problems of the parking requirements theme. And the proposed solutions, and then the primary question. So after this, you can actually be done with a survey. But if you would like a deeper dive into this theme and this topic, you can continue on into the clarifying questions. And then you continue on with the same theme into theme J. Our code writers will be coming back to you at focused workshops number 3 and 4 with more specific alternatives for how these concepts might or might not apply in different areas. This survey will be open until January 27th. If you would like to take the survey on a different day. And if you have any questions after the workshop, email the team at atlzoning2@tsw-design.com. And if you did not catch that, you can actually scroll down on the same survey link that I sent, and all the project information is here. So the workshop is now over, so you can sign off Zoom and take the survey. If you have any further questions about how to take the survey, stay on and I will answer them for you.